Thank you for tuning in to Finding Kim Amero, Chapter 4, Jane and Dylan. Whether you're listening to this on the podcast or watching this on the documentary, I appreciate you joining me on this journey. In October of 2009, a letter was sent to the high school of a cousin of the Amero siblings. The letter said that the writer, we're going to assume here for the sake of telling the story, was a male, and that the writer had written a letter years before to the police, and the police had done nothing about it. He also said that Kim was buried in Hampton near a log cabin and gave pretty specific details of where they could find that cabin. How did he know this? He said that he and a relative were both psychics and had been having visions and meditating on Kim's disappearance for years, and that he had found them this time around on a Facebook page created in December of 2007 regarding Kim's disappearance. The Ameros were smart. They took the letter immediately to the RCMP, but they had some questions for the cops. They asked the cops where this other letter was. How come we were never notified there was a letter? How come no one ever told us that someone had reached out to you about Kim's disappearance and Kim's current whereabouts, and you did nothing about it? The police had some bad news for the Ameros. They said that letter was given to a secretary. She was told to retype it. She did, but she threw out the original and she threw out the envelope. So now there's no shot of DNA or fingerprints. And the police officer also said, and nobody knows where this retyped letter of this version ever went. It was entered, but never processed. Now, I don't understand police processes, but whatever that means it's gone forever. Good. You're never going to find it again. So that's a little disheartening for the Ameros to hear. They decided to take matter into their own hands, which was very smart. They put a message out on Facebook that said, hey, to the writer of this letter, we've gone to Hampton. We can't find this log cabin. Can your visions be more specific? Can you meditate on it further and help us find her? About a week went by, and Lorraine Amero, the Amero siblings' mother, received a phone call. The phone call was from a man calling from this phone booth. The call was traced. This phone booth here, which sat at the very entrance of the St. John Exhibition Fairground where Kim went missing. The caller said, you will find a tape at the St. John Exhibition Fairground where Kim went missing, and on this tape will be specific enough details where you will definitely find Kim Amero. So, of course, Lorraine hangs up the phone, calls her family, and they go rushing over to the St. John Fairground. Now, they did call the RCMP, and the RCMP did come, but after looking around for about 5 minutes, they said, you know what, we don't have time to look for a letter from a psychic, so give us a call if you find it. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to put the brakes on right here. I was in nursing for a very brief period of my life. I wanted to have a trade behind me. In case the world fell apart, you'll always need nurses. So I figured that would be a good piece of paper to have. I didn't enjoy it, but one of the reasons why I didn't enjoy it is because I found that over time, nurses started to treat the patients like they weren't people, like they were working on an assembly factory line. They forgot that each person was an individual, that each case was new, that each case was for a different person. And it really bothered me. And then I found myself starting to do that. I don't know, call it human nature. I tried not to do it, and I eventually did it, and it really bothered me that I was treating people like that. And I feel like in this instance, the police were treating the Ameros like they were on an assembly line where, you know what, psychics lead to nothing. Our history shows us that this means nothing. So we don't really have time to hang out with you and help you find your sister, because we're pretty sure that this tape in the bushes or wherever it's supposed to be isn't going to amount to anything. So we're going to go. But hey, you know what? You guys go ahead, fill your boots. If you find something, let us know. I find that to be a crappy attitude. And I'm sorry that those police officers had reached that point in their career that they were treating people like that. But the Ameros did find the tape. They dug for about 5 or 6 minutes at more after the police left, and they found it under a bush, the bush that you see here. They called the RCMP and said, we found the tape. The RCMP then came and collected the tape, but the Ameros were smart. They knew that evidence had already been lost of Kim's. They knew that this letter was gone. So they decided that they wanted a copy of this letter. They were demanding a copy of this letter, or of this tape, I'm sorry. So the police did. They gave them 2 CDs. The tape was very long. It was like 2 hours long. So they broke it into 2 CDs and gave them a copy. A little time went by. The Ameros listened to the tape, obviously. And they had gone out to Hampton looking for this log cabin. The only thing they could really find was a burnt-out foundation. So they wondered that if the burnt-out foundation was once the log cabin that the psychic was speaking of. So they called the RCMP to talk about it. The RCMP said, we haven't even listened to the tape yet. It's a really long tape to listen to. So I'll tell you what. You guys listen back and tell us the timestamp where the writer and the tape maker started talking about her whereabouts, and then we'll take it from there. You just call us back with the timestamp so we don't have to listen to the whole thing. Again, treating them like they're on an assembly line and not treating them like humans and not treating their case like it's an individual case. That's so unfortunate that that happened to the Ameros. But the Ameros followed the instructions and said, yep, if you go to this point in the tape, this is where you're going to find where she is or where he explains her to be. However, they couldn't find the cabin. They couldn't find the cabin anywhere. They could only find this burnt out foundation at that time. Around the end of October of that year, the RCMP went up to the property with an archaeologist. The archaeologist x-rayed the ground and gave two notable places of interest that were near that burnt foundation, which was kind of solidifying the idea that that burnt out foundation was once the log cabin. But the Ameros kept searching anyways, and about 70 feet from that burnt out foundation, they did find a log cabin. Now, because the x-rays showed two notable areas for them to dig, the RCMP really concentrated on that area outside the burnt out foundation. Further taking matters into their own hands, the Amero siblings were very smart. They bought a tree stand, and they put a hunting camera in the tree stand so they could monitor the progress. They were told a million times that the police were going to dig, and they would go up there and no one would show up. Once two police officers came up with shovels, which is ridiculous, obviously. Frost was coming. They were worried that the police weren't going to start digging to the following year, so they took it into their own hands, and they brought up shovels to dig around the burnt-out foundation where these two notable areas were. Again, they found nothing. Now, keep in mind they did have the permission of the property owners this entire time. Then they decided to go even further. They weren't getting anywhere with the police, really, and the police weren't too excited to spend a lot of money on a dig there, although they did get the archaeologist up there to x-ray the ground. They also brought a cadaver dog up to search around the burnt-out foundation, and no new info came. They decided to dig on their own. They took to their community and asked someone to help them, someone to go and excavate these two places. And they did. Unfortunately, the excavation turned up nothing. The Ameros always wondered, though, if that second log cabin that they found was where Kim was kept or where Kim was buried. But unfortunately, they exhausted all of their resources concentrating on these two areas that the x-ray machines had found. And the police didn't hire diggers. They hired cops with shovels and picks. So obviously the police weren't taking this CD very seriously, and the property owner all of a sudden changed his mind. So before that they could dig at the log cabin area, the property owner went, nope, we're all done. You're not digging here anymore. Even though they had put back the land exactly how they had found it, the property owner said, no, you're not digging on this property. And it was during this time that this argument was going on with the property owner that a car drove by. Now that doesn't seem strange, but this is serious boondocks, folks. This is serious, like where they dug is in the middle of nowhere. And this car drives by. Come to find out later in life that that car belonged to Jane and Dylan's father, Randy. He drove by. Now, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to start the Jane and Dylan interview, because this is where this story becomes important to Jane and Dylan. This is their version of those exact events and how it affected their lives. I am super proud of Jane and Dylan for being able to talk about what they talked about with me and for being so forthcoming and sweet to me. They're amazing. These two are amazing, amazing human beings. Now, I'm not sure if I mentioned this on the last podcast documentary or not, but Jane's an animal lover. So she rescues animals. So she's got all these rescued animals all over her house. It's crazy. Like you walk in there and you are in a zoo, and they love every one of them and they know the names of every one of them. Their house is so full of love. It's incredible, which makes me more proud of them for telling this story, and it breaks my heart a little more because such terrible things happen to such good people. Jane and Dylan at first didn't know really where to begin their story. So I handed the mic to Dylan and I said, you know what? Just start me at the beginning. This is what he had to say.
It all came out to me when I was 9, about 9.5 probably. He started by telling me a bedtime story about how this girl was kidnapped and molested for weeks, basically. And then she one day escaped and then was clubbed in the back of the head and killed. And yeah, that was the bedtime story I was told. So shortly after the story and that, he started going on about all this paranormal stuff and psychic things going on, that you could talk to the dead, and that eventually, well, he first started trying to talk to the dead. He tried to do a seance with me shortly after this story, and late at night, it was like probably like 11:30, pitch black room, he tries to do a seance. I don't really remember much of it besides he tried to talk to dead and that, and from there on, he kind of would try to talk to her and so on, or try to talk to her through me. He brought up the name Kim shortly after the story, like pretty much right after he told me, like literally the same night he said, "This is a true story. This happened," and he said how mentioned 30 some years ago how he was hunting in the woods, according to him, and he heard a girl scream, a loud, sharp scream that was cut out halfway, as if clubbed in the head in Upham, because he said he consistently would hunt up there all the time back then. He took me out to Upham a few times actually to try and see spots, see if I could communicate with Kim, see if I could talk to her and find the spots. Try to take me to different areas, like past a well, to see if I could figure anything out. In his mind or idea of making it look good or something, he would take me out there to try and make it seem like he was trying to solve things.
Right here, I ask Jane and Dylan about the letters that Randy sent to the police and to the cousin of the Amero siblings.
The letters she sent to the family would have been first, because he had apparently sent some to them long before, I think. I think that was shortly before the tape, if I recall. Because I remember that was the only letter. Yeah, that was the only letter I knew of back then. He had sent it, I think, just before, at the same time as the tape. And the tape I did know that he had put out, because he had came and got me that same day as the tape, and had actually watched through his window with binoculars as they looked for the tape. I never actually got to listen to the tape until long after. I don't really remember much besides what he had told me too that day is what I remember. He mentioned how he had talked about, I think, the case, and tried to say whereabouts of the body, if I recall, or where he had heard or whatever the body was, supposedly, or something, to try and get them to search.
Here I asked Jane to tell me about the first time she ever heard of Kim Amero, or the disappearance of Kim Amero.
I was actually talking to my brother one night on the phone, and he asked if I had noticed anything different with how Randy was acting. And of course, knowing how odd Randy is, I basically said, he's acting stranger than normal. And my brother said, well, yeah. He said he was over at his home and had started going on about this Kim girl again. And I had no clue at the time what he was talking about. And he asked me basically, have you ever heard him talk about Kim Amero and her missing and so on? I said, no, it's all new to me. And he had mentioned the name a few times and said, he went back years and years and years, always talked about it when we were growing up, which I found really odd because, again, I'd never ever heard of it until about 2009, 2010. And at the time, my mom was actually coming over, and I had asked her if she had ever heard the name of a missing girl named Kimberly Amero. And she said, well, yeah, she used to babysit you. And then she kind of asked me why, and I said, well, there's a chance that Randy might be involved in her disappearance. And, of course, at the time, none of certain other things had come out, and my mom kind of said, well, I can't see him being involved in something like that. And then nothing more was really thought of it. And then a few days later, I was at work, and a couple friends had come in and asked me if Randy was my father. And I had said, well, reluctantly, yes. And they basically said why, and said that there was a tape, and had asked me if I could listen to it and see if I knew the voice. So I had gone out to Kim's cousin's house with them, and soon as they started playing the tape, within seconds I knew the voice and told them, yeah, that's Randy. And from there everything just took off. Yeah, I started asking my son about it, and at the time he was still going over there to visit Randy, as he knew nothing of the bad things. And Randy had brought him home there one night, and my brother and I had already been talking about it, and we started kind of questioning Randy about it. And we sat here in the living room, and he started going on about the whole thing and talking about Kim and her disappearance and how he was a psychic, which was hard not to die laughing. And finally, after a little while, we basically told him that if this is the truth and he knows all this about it, he needs to go to the police, which he honestly didn't want to go in until we basically convinced him that if we went with him. So later that night, my brother, myself, and Randy went to the police station. He went up to the counter and said to the cop that he was the tipster in the Amero case. And at the time, the officer that was in charge of the case wasn't in. So they basically told him go home for the night and come back tomorrow, whatever. So we did, and when we went back the next morning, they took us all right upstairs and took Randy directly into the interview room. Well, my brother and I waited out in the other room, and they interviewed him for a while. Another cop had come out and kind of tried to put us at ease, saying, he's being treated well and so on, which we really didn't care. And the cop could tell looking at me that there was something off. And I basically had stated that I honestly didn't care how he was treated. We were only there to make sure that he actually came in to be interviewed with this. And the cop was kind of thrown off at how cold we were towards Randy, but at the time he didn't know the whole story. So
here I asked Jane where Dylan being a conduit for her father's psychic powers came into play, really.
That was just all in the tape and I think in the letter. But he kind of let up on that when they started interviewing him and focused it more on himself, but he would also still put stuff off on stating, well, yeah, I heard it from a relative and so on. They kind of chalked it up to him being a bit nutty and kind of sent him home and didn't hear nothing more for a few days. And then finally one of the cops had come into my work and another cop had contacted my mom at home and basically wanted the two of us to come in and tell whatever we knew about it. So the two of us had gone in, and right away, one of the cops had asked if I thought Randy was capable of hurting anyone, and I pretty much just told him flat out, well, yeah, I know for a fact that he is. And of course the cop asked how I knew, and that's when I told him that he had molested me from the time I was 7 till I was 16. At which point they basically stopped the interview because it opened up a whole new case. He was charged a little while later, and the cops honestly didn't think that we would win the case because it was so long ago. It was basically my word against his. But in the end, he was convicted and got 30 months, which he only served like 10.
Here I asked Jane if the police took him seriously and actually dug into his claims. Did they take him out to show him where she was, or was it all just chalked up to nonsense? I will add a side note. It also has come to my attention that he told the police that he knew the Amero family from way back, and he actually knew their home address from where they lived way back then. This is what Jane had to say.
They took him out, I think, at one point and tried to get him to pinpoint the exact location that was described in the tapes and in the letters, and he couldn't pinpoint this area. Or if he could, he wasn't doing it. He literally gave full details of the location, how she was murdered, where she was kept. They found nothing, no. And at one point when they were up there searching, he had actually drove by the location to see basically what was going on. And Upham's like in the middle of nowhere.
When did you find...
Here I asked Jane an awkward question, because I'm not sure if she's going to remember this or not, or if she was present for these events, but I asked her about the box that was in the ceiling that I learned about from my husband. Did she remember the box, that had the hair in it, and I believe it was a pair of glasses. This is what she had to say.
Oh God, when we were kids, basically, there was a little hole between the basement ceiling and the first floor of the house. There was a little spot where the heater was, and it had been removed. My grandmother used to keep a safe there at one point, and at the time there was a little I think it was a wooden box. And in the box there was a pair of old glasses and a chunk of hair, and I think there was something else in there. And once it was discovered, he ended up moving it. When we asked what it was, he had said that the glasses belonged to my brother. They were his first glasses, so he held on to them as a keepsake. And the hair apparently was from my first haircut, which was a load of crap. Because I didn't live with him when I had my first haircut. I lived with my mother. And the hair wasn't even the right color, so. He got full custody of me, I believe, October, right around the exact time Kim disappeared. Just basically said that my mother was unfit and just didn't have enough money to properly raise me, and of course his parents vouched for him that he was fantastic, and if he wasn't home they would be home. And whether or not they had any idea of any of this, I honestly don't know. As I said, I didn't even have two clues until basically I had that conversation with my brother and then confronted at work by people about it.
At this point, a lot of emotions had already happened. You know, we were only 12 minutes in. So I asked Jane flat out the $6 million question. Did she think that Randy is guilty of kidnapping or hurting or even killing Kim Amero?
Oh, I think he's guilty as hell. There's no way you go on about something for, well, I mean, at the time it came out, I think it was 26 years Kim had been missing. From what I've learned, he went on about it from shortly after the time she disappeared. And as I said, my brother knew all about it. My son knew all about it. I had no clue. The
story started to get a little jumbled here. We were jumping from event to event, and I wanted to keep it on an even timeline. So I interrupted here, and I asked Jane, when did she find out about Dylan's involvement in all of this?
That all came out right around the time that my brother and I first noticed the overly weird behavior.
Shortly after that, Mom asked me if I knew who Kim Amero was, and then that night, he got upset and had started crying because he didn't want to get Randy in trouble at the time. I mean, at the time, he did still care about him, and, you know, I didn't want to hurt him anymore. Yeah. Like, he didn't know about the molestation and the extent of how crazy Randy was. So later on, I had asked him to see if I could call Randy and talk to him. Just casual talk, normal talk. And so I started talking to him after I called him once or twice because he didn't answer and then called back. So I started talking to him and just about anything, I think. And then in the middle of the conversation, I just flat out asked, out of nowhere, did you kill her? And all he could actually respond with was, you know me better than that. Couldn't even say no or anything. And then he said he was going to come down, and that's when they started talking to him, my uncle and my mother. And at that point, I had went upstairs before he even showed up because I was just devastated. I was crying, couldn't focus, couldn't think. That night or once after would have been the last time I spoke to him, I think. Probably that night. And I feel nothing but hatred towards him. No. He, at one point, sent a white hamper. I used to keep toys and that, like toy guns and swords and stupid little stuff, to the house. And it had, like, used game cards that I had when I was a kid. Like,
my aunt, who lives in Ontario, actually, Randy had gotten her to write a letter on his behalf, basically begging for us to meet with Randy and talk to him, and basically her trying to say for us to try to work things out and just really stupid things like that. And there was no working it out. I mean, that's, you know, somebody's being looked at for murder. He's a child molester. There's no working that out.
Talking about what happened to Jane as a little girl was tough. She is a true survivor. I asked her what happened in the end of it all. Did Randy admit to what he had done to her in court, or did he plead not guilty, or did he just get up there and go, yeah, I did it? This is what Jane had to say.
Oh, he denies that to all the way. He was actually asked to take a polygraph for Kim, I think, 4 times. And the first couple times he agreed, he would do it, and then when the time came, he'd refuse. Once the stuff came out for the molestation charges, automatically his tone changed and he would not take a polygraph. Which, I mean, anybody who has half a clue knows you can't combine 2 cases and ask on a polygraph about 2 cases. I would say his fear was that they were going to ask him about me, and he knows he would fail that for sure. But as far as the whole part about Kim, I mean, if it was me, being looked at for murder and so on. Somebody asked me to take a polygraph, I'd be all over it. Whereas with him, it was, no, don't want to do it. You know, I mean, if you didn't do it and you're just a nut job trying to get attention saying you're a psychic, then take the polygraph and, yeah, basically look like a nut job. At least people aren't looking at you as you're a murderer. But he still, to this day, will not do it.
Here, I asked Jane if she thinks that the police believe that he's involved somehow, or do they think he's just an obsessed nut job? Because his actions speak to both ends of that spectrum. Maybe he knows exactly where she is, and this is his panicky way of trying to involve himself without incriminating himself. Or maybe he is just a wacky nut job. I don't know what the police were thinking on this, and I thought maybe Jane would have some insights, and she had such a close relationship with the police at this point. This is what she had to say.
I think that they do think he was involved. They just don't know to what extent, which is the hard part. I mean, there's no remains, the locations that he sent them, there's never been anything found except for the letters or whatever it was he left up in Upham. So, I mean, you're basically taking his word and going with that. And I mean, as I said, this is something he went on with for, well, from what I gather, the time I was 7 up until it was all brought out in around 2010. So if you had nothing to do with this case, why are you so interested? You know, why contact the family? Why send letters? It doesn't make sense.
No.
Here we kind of had a laugh. I asked Jane if her father had claimed to be a psychic before. I had asked her earlier, but I'd never really gotten the answer. Like, you know, was he, when she was growing up, acting this way? She kind of giggles, and this is what she says about that.
No. Not as long as I can remember. He never ever went on that he was a psychic or seen anything or any of those things.
The whole thing with Randy going on about being a psychic and all that first came out shortly after the night where he told me the story about her. Maybe not even a week after, because he decided to do the seance. And then from there, he just kept going on more and more about it. And within a year, he was going on all these psychic sites, going on, and eventually started having past stories about paranormal events and all that. All had to do with ghosts, talking to the dead, communicating with the dead. Honestly, it more just seemed like a convenient excuse of fabricated reality.
To Dylan here, I ask, what was your purpose in all of this besides being a scapegoat? You know, because he did kind of, you know, say my relative is the visionary, not me type deal at the beginning. And I said, how do you explain your role in this? Like, or how did he explain your role in this?
I haven't researched any of it in the past. I don't remember much of it past what he said. It was something like a psychic needs a conduit to speak the dead through.
Okay.
Kind of like you see on the shows. They hold hands or whatever, and they talk through one person and they speak. So he would essentially hold my hand, talk to me, and I would communicate the deceased person's thought, essentially. Which, honestly, to me, it was in the pitch black. He could have very easily been quietly whispering in my ear, for all I know. I don't remember too well. And I was a kid. Pitch black room, I can't see my hand in front of my face. And he continued to do all this type stuff right up until I was 12. So, 9 through 12. Yeah, he was very clear on he wanted me to keep quiet about it. Maybe paranoid constantly that my parents would be mad or so on. He would often try to turn me against my father, actually.
I wondered here if Dylan had been involved in the letter writing or the tape recording. So I asked him. This is what he had to say.
Letter you had mentioned, he had me help him not write it, but he had basically asked me for advice on how to keep it anonymous, how untraceable, essentially.
Dylan had told me off the record that out of paranoia, Randy had gotten rid of his computer after he typed the letter, figuring that they would be able to find it somehow if they ever were to dig through his computer. This is what he had to say.
So, probably when I was 10 or 11, the information he told me about this computer was that they could link it to him with Kim or something, in the sense of, in his mind, or what he had told me was he didn't want to get unfairly linked to it and have the wrong idea out. So he had me help him ditch the computer. He, essentially what he did was put his computer in a garbage bag and throw it in a lake. and then later got paranoid and got the computer back from the lake. And from there, I believe he destroyed it. He didn't really say much about that. Honestly, I think he ditched the computer because it was probably full of child porn. Which he would always look at porn when I was at the house there. Like, I'd walk into the room and he'd freak out, start hollering, say, go back out of the room for a minute. Or I could be in the bathroom taking a bath. I could hear the computer, loud volume, moaning in that. Obvious, even to a kid, what he's looking at. Like,
Whoa.
like he was messed up enough that I'd be in the living room with him because he had the sofa by the window, and then on the other side of the room, to the left of the chair, if I was watching TV, he had his computer set up with his back to me. He would actually watch porn while I was in the room while I was watching TV, thinking I couldn't tell.
So why all of this? I asked Dylan here. If Randy's worried about being caught, why get involved at all?
He wants attention. He wants to be close to the case. He wants to see what's happening. He's narcissistic. He wants to be there. He wants it to be watched. He wants it to be seen. No, he just wants to play. It's a game to him.
So to Jane here, I say, if he involves himself, then he freaks out and tries to cover his tracks. What do you make of all of this? And Jane had this response.
That's why Randy started going on about a couple other missing girls right around the same time that he knew everything was going to come out about Kim, because he had actually said at one point, things are going to come out and you may end up hating me for a while. So at that point, he had started going on a few other sites and throwing out little tidbits of information which were, general knowledge, basically, saying he was a psychic. Basically just to throw the attention off himself and make it seem like, okay, this guy's, giving advice in other cases, so he isn't just focused on Kim. If you look back around that time frame, it only went back about a year. So he was already, I think in his mind, he knew this was all going to come out soon. So it was his way of basically covering his ass.
When he first started going on about the psychic stuff and that, because for a long while it was just talk through me, because I essentially to him was the psychic. You kind of see his narcissistic streak after a bit come through, because he started going on that he was the powerful one, the psychic that could talk to them and all that. And all of a sudden, all these sites, he was the powerful one that could talk to the dead, communicate with them, and hear all these things. Suddenly skipping past the fact, an idea of a conduit. He wanted the attention to be at the forefront to get his ego streaked, basically. And it only seemed to grow in the psychic sense over the years, and more wanting the attention drawn to himself, involving more and more cases. He brought up more cases almost to diffuse attention from the Kim Amero case.
Here, for a minute or two off the record, Jane, Dylan, and I are discussing the probability of Randy pulling this off all alone. I asked Jane on the record, does it make sense that he did this alone? She had this to say.
Because he would be.
I mean, the hard part is we've all had thoughts that he had other people involved with him, because he's not that smart.
Not?
Like, seriously, he is not that intelligent to go with all of this on his own. There's no way. Like, I don't know. I don't see him being that intelligent. Do I honestly think he was involved in her murder? Yes. Do I think he did this all by himself? No. I think there was at least one other person involved, and that person either has something over him or he has something over that person, and that's why nothing has come out.
Completely off topic here. I asked Jane how Randy explained his actions against her in court, and if somehow Kim made her way into the conversation. Dylan wanted me to understand something right away, so first he grabbed the mic and said this.
My mom always hated him. She never
hit it.
ever showed any love towards him. She always was quick to insult him or run him down. She never stood up for him or that.
When everything came out, Randy automatically turned around and stated that I was lying about the molestation and so on because myself and my mother were such close friends with the Amero family. And I had no idea who these people were until 2009, 2010. My mom knew, and she did hang out with Kim's mom and I think one or two of the sisters, years and years and years ago. But as far as I can recall, I mean, I was like 2, maybe 3 when Kim babysat me, so I've got no clue who this girl is. So I mean, why would I conjure up something like molestation from my father, of all people, to make it look good against, this whole other family who I don't know.
Right.
What kind of person does that? Yeah, so I mean, the whole idea, well, you came out with molestation and I did all these things to you, you're saying this because you're such great friends with the family. I like the family, I mean, they're nice people, but why would I come out with those type things? It made no sense, and this was the whole thing that he stuck with the whole time. That was his story. That's how we all got involved, was because we're such great friends with the family and we all drink together and all these things. I don't even drink, first of all, so it made no sense. But that was his defense with it. No, I mean, he would get up on the stand in court and make jokes and just totally get the judge totally irritated. There was a day that his lawyer, I think, was late, and he actually had the nerve to turn around to the Crown prosecutor and say, well, I mean, the Crown prosecutor asked him where his lawyer was, and he's like, well, you should be the one trying to find him. And the Crown just looked at me like, is he for real? That's just him. He's an idiot. I mean, everything when we were in court was a joke to him. And even some of the people who took the stand in his defense, his brothers went on the stand for him, and I mean, these are people who never were at that home. They swore up and down that there was no closet in the middle bedroom, because he had actually poked holes in the wall so he could watch me undressing and so on, and they swore up and down there was no closet in this bedroom. Even he can tell you there was a closet in the bedroom.
Yeah.
Like there was a big cutout hole in the gyprock and holes punched in it, and nope, there's no closet there. Well, even my cousin, I mean, I had no idea he knew what was going on. I knew, but again, he was a kid, what's he gonna do? And he actually confronted our grandparents about it, and they basically pulled him in front of Randy and basically confronted him about it. So, I mean, he basically got, scared shitless and had to shut up about it. And then when everything came out, I had messaged my cousin and asked him if he had noticed anything odd growing up in that house. I didn't come right out and say it, and his words were, do you mean the special relationship between you and Randy? So I mean, even he knew, and we were the exact same age. So I mean, it wasn't something that was well hidden in that house. And one of the guys who took the stand for him, actually, I ran into him at the Superstore, and I was trying to avoid him. He actually asked me if he could talk to me for a second. So reluctantly, I said yes. And he basically said he started crying. And he's, I didn't want to take the stand. He said there wasn't much I could say. He said I got a subpoena to be there on his behalf. He said I knew something was wrong in that house. I didn't do anything about it, and basically asked for my forgiveness.
That's his guilt.
And he said, I will never speak to him again. He said, and if somebody ever did something like that to my daughter, I'd kill him. So, I mean, that was one of the people that he got to take the stand for him and thought would lie for him.
Our interview is coming to a close. So I asked them one question. Final thoughts? And this is what they both told me.
My honest opinion, I think he's 100% guilty. I do think there's possibly somebody else involved.
I think, honestly, beyond a doubt, Randy is absolutely guilty of killing Kim Amero. I think he did abduct her, and I think he did molest her and kill her.
If you're wondering why I didn't play a copy of the tape, one, it's 1 to 2 hours long, and two, I don't have it. Right now, I have a computer guru friend of mine doing some crazy surgery on a computer. It's our last hope. The Ameros made an official request for new copies of this tape, and they were denied. The police said, sorry, active investigation. You can't have copies, even though they were happy to give them copies years ago. Now they're saying, no, you can't have copies, which makes me wonder if they've lost this tape. I'm not positive, but that makes me wonder, because it's the Ameros. It's their sister the tape is about. Give them a copy, and they won't. So obviously they're not going to give me a copy. Ed had them on an old computer. I went out to his house because I'm somewhat techie, and on this old computer, it wasn't there. We got it going, we got it started. Ed was able to look at these 2 audio files, but he said, no, you know what? They're playlists. I'm certain of it. So now I have someone working on a laptop, which is my only chance. If I do get a copy off this laptop, our next episode, we're going to listen to bits and pieces. Now, as you heard Dylan mention, he had been out there quite a few times with Randy. Randy took him out there to see if he could see anything and tried to use him as a conduit to communicate. So Jane and Dylan are going to take me out to this grounds. or to these grounds. They're going to show me where he claims Kim Amero is. And I'm going to see if I can piece some pieces together. I'm going to try and go to this log cabin for the Ameros and see if there's something that I personally can do for them here. I don't know what I can do. I'm very frustrated that I didn't get a copy of this tape for me to listen to, for me to try and decipher. I'm going to work off everything the Ameros have told me thus far and everything that Jane and Dylan told me thus far. And I'm going to go to this property and just see. Just be there and just see. See what I can. I don't know. I don't know what I can do. Maybe I can talk to the landowner about redigging near that log cabin. I'm not sure. Now, I'm going to tell you here that I have mailed Randy a letter. I was dishonest in my letter. I shouldn't have been. It's like writing the letter to Michael Wayne McGray. What do you say when you want them to tell you something? I didn't know. So I approached the letter like this, and it was on advice of some people that know him and some people that don't. Told me this was the best approach, and I trust them because I couldn't figure out the best approach myself. I played it as if that I'm doing a documentary about psychics who aren't taken seriously or psychics that help in missing person cases, and how excited I was to learn that a local person was actually attempting to help in a murder case or a missing persons case, and that he had these visions that she was murdered, and nobody did anything further about it. We just kind of dug once or twice with some shovels and picks. The Ameros got an excavator up there, and that's all we did. And, you know, how dare they? And my goal is to get an interview with Randy so that I can hopefully, I've been taking some courses, again, I'm no expert here, maybe get him to say something he didn't say before, or to recall a memory, or, you know, him claim it as a vision. I haven't heard back from him at this time. I have heard that he has family in town, but I'm not positive. So if this letter doesn't communicate with him, I am going to try a phone call, and then I'm going to try knocking on his front door. I think that if he can or will agree to meet with me, that maybe I can get him to say something he didn't say before. And when the Ameros watch it back or hear it back, they'll go, ding, he never said that location before, or he never said that before, or that Jane and Dylan can do the same. So next episode is kind of up in the air, whether or not I get these copies of these tapes and whether or not Randy agrees to meet with me. Now, I'd love to know what you think at this point, hearing all of the facts without my opinion. Do you think that he did it? Or maybe you think that he didn't do it. I don't know. You can find this whole documentary and podcast on Facebook, facebook.com/Finding Kim Amero. You can email me at jamie@live.ca. There's also a comments and discussion section at findingkimamero.com. If you have any information whatsoever, or if you're the owner of these lands that I speak of, I would love for you to get in touch with me. Now, if you have any information regarding the disappearance of Kim Amero, I would ask you at this time to forward it to the St. John Police Department. But like I said, next week's episode is a little bit up in the air. It took me a long time to absorb the massive amounts of information that Jane and Dylan gave me. And now all I can think about is getting that interview and getting that copy of that tape. And hopefully I get both. I don't know. So until next Thursday morning, I'm Jamie Splood, and thank you for listening to Finding Kim Amero, Chapter 4, Jane and Dylan. Also, side note here, thank you again to Jane and Dylan, two of the greatest people, definitely. Thanks again. I'm on a belly leave, for 20 years of counting, you've been alone.